So welcome to this Wise Words academic seminar. This is one in a series. It's hosted by the Contemplative Studies Center here at the University of Melbourne. I am Nicholas Van Dam, the director of the center. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land in which we are present today. And we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Indigenous or First Nations people present with us here today. So today we're joined by Professor Willem Kleiken, the Rietveld Professor of Mindfulness and Psychological Science at the University of Oxford and the Director of the Oxford Mindfulness Center. His work focuses mainly on depression and its prevention and treatment. In particular, his research examines how mindfulness and mindfulness-based programs can prevent depression and enhance human potential across the lifespan. In today's presentation, we're going to hear about the results and implications of a research study exploring whether school-based mindfulness training is an effective, accessible, and scalable way to promote mental health and well-being in adolescence. And I think there's some hints about more general applications that I'm really excited to hear about. Please save your questions till the end of the presentation. We'll take them at that point. We will be recording the event, but we won't be recording questions at the end. So we'll continue the recording, but we'll edit that bit out. So don't worry about asking your questions and having them subsequently being on YouTube. We'll make sure to get that out. So thank you so much for coming, and welcome, Willem.
Thank you for the invitation to come, and congratulations on the amazing centre here. And it's a real pleasure to be here in Melbourne. What an amazing city and an amazing country. So I have the opportunity to tell you about a study which I think has got some really interesting implications. And it represents 8 years of work in which we explored whether mindfulness-based training delivered in schools could be a way of promoting mental health and preventing depression in young people. This was work that was carried out by a number of excellent collaborators and colleagues. The work was co-led by myself, Mark Williams, Sarah Jane Blakemore, and Tim Dalgleish at the University of Cambridge. But probably it's fair to say over 100 different researchers at various points throughout the project were involved in this work. We were incredibly lucky to build an extraordinary team to do this work. So what I'll be talking to you about is work that represents the recruitment of about 28,000 children, more than 100 schools, many of whom worked with us for over 3 years, more than 650 teachers. We have 20 million data points, which we will continue to research, and in fact we will have an open access approach to this, so if people have questions they want to ask of this data set, we're going to try and make a way of facilitating that. And we've already had about 20 published peer-reviewed science papers reporting the main findings from this work thus far. So this is what I'd like to do in my talk. What problem were we trying to solve? What did we know already? What did we do? What did we find? And given what we found, where do we go next? I think it's always good, although I know many of you will know many of the things I'm about to say, but it's also always good just to be reminded of it and remind ourselves of the challenge that we're actually facing. The World Health Organization estimates that about between 250 and 300 million people in the world today are struggling with diagnosable depression. If you look at the world population, which is over 7 billion at the moment, that means about 1 billion people in the world alive today will be directly affected by common mental health problems. In so-called developed nations, only about 1 in 5 will get reasonable mental health care, or will get access to and use reasonable mental health care. And in low and middle income countries, that's as low as 1 in 27. So we have a real public health challenge, and we have a real need to redress that challenge. And I think towards the end of my talk, I want to frame that challenge in a slightly broader way. We also have, I think, a particular problem with young people. By the way, all of the papers I'm going to be citing are, I think, broadly speaking, open access. And the DOI links at the bottom of all these slides means you can access them, a copy of the slides, and actually as many of the papers as possible. I've put in a Dropbox folder which will be circulated for folks after the talk. I think it's fair to say that most people would recognize that we have an urgent need to think about how we take care of and promote the mental health of young people. Estimates are somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 12 young people are experiencing significant mental health problems. And in certain groups, that is going up. In girls, for example, that's going up, and we're seeing eating disorders and rates of self-injury at quite alarming levels in some of those groups. But more than that, adolescence is an absolutely extraordinary time of transformation and change. A time where potentially people could be learning skills, could be relating to their peers, could be enjoying families and schools and community contexts where their growth and their development and their human flourishing is being realized. And I'm not sure that we're all entirely convinced that we are doing that very well at the moment. So, the final thing I think I'd say here is just sort of to acknowledge one of my co-PIs' work, Sarah Jane Blakemore, who has done some extraordinary work on the development of the adolescent brain and the way in which the adolescent brain is developing in different ways and at different stages throughout the period from 11 through 24, and how at those different stages we can be really thoughtful about what we might be doing to facilitate young people's mental health. And again, there, her argument would be that we're not doing that very well. So, for example, in many parts of the world, we assess young people's academic achievement a lot. And at developmental ages where perhaps it wouldn't be a good idea to do that because they're in the midst of going through puberty and at different times and at different phases. So I think there's a lot we can learn from the science about how to promote and support the mental health of young people that we're not doing. So what we tried to do with this work was ask, has mindfulness training in adolescence the potential to shift the population away from psychological problems and towards improved mental health by addressing key processes of mental regulation and executive control that operate across the spectrum of risk and resilience? So what you'll see there is a sort of key foundational skill that we think relates to the whole population, and an intervention, mindfulness, that we think that might speak to that, and a delivery unit, schools, where we thought it might be a good idea to do that work. What did we know already? Well, I've said a little bit about adolescence as being a key developmental window, but I do think this slide is really telling. And I think this data is actually shifting over time. And what you can see is that most mental health problems will arise in mid to late adolescence, and certainly by early adulthood. So that has a very obvious implication, doesn't it? The obvious implication is, can we get in and do something to support young people before we see this spike in mental health problems? Not only because that's a good thing to do, but because it also may well have downstream implications. Why did we think mindfulness training would be the right way to go? Well, it's an intervention that targets the whole population. In a sense, it's not relying active symptoms of psychopathology, as, for example, cognitive behavioral interventions are. It was designed in terms of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy anyway for prevention, and it is targeting the very mechanisms that we think might play out across the whole population. Why now? What work had we done to prepare for the MYRIAD trial? Well, we'd done 25 years of work with adults. So Mark Williams, Indel Siegel, John Teasdale had developed an intervention, an 8-week program that is called Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapy for Depression, and it teaches people skills to recognize the early warning signs of depression, to decenter from those, to learn some new ways of responding that has been, in more than 9 randomized controlled trials, shown to be effective. More effective than comparator conditions, And strikingly, in relation to antidepressant medication, which is the mainstay approach to preventing depression in adults, appears to be as good as, statistically maybe slightly better, but as good as maintenance antidepressant treatment. And that's led to it being in the clinical guidelines for adults for the prevention of depression in many countries around the world, including Australia. Why did we think that that would translate to adolescence? So people, to get funding to do a large-scale trial, you normally have to demonstrate proof of concept. So we ran 3 feasibility trials, testing mindfulness-based interventions in schools, and all 3 feasibility trials, small trials, showed a signal. They all demonstrated that we could get the kids, we could get the teachers trained, we could get the kids in the classes receiving the training, and we demonstrated small signal in terms of reducing stress, depression, and improving mental health. We also did a systematic review and meta-analysis. Many funding agencies will require this. We published this in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, and again, promising evidence of signal. But of course, what this systematic review, and many systematic reviews, and by the way, I think just as a methodology level, this study is also, I think, a bit of a commentary on systematic reviews, is as many systematic reviews at an early phase of development showed, a lot of heterogeneity in the studies. So you have problematic designs in terms of control groups that perhaps are suboptimal. You don't have very long follow-ups, you don't have blinding, and that's no criticism of the authors, because the authors are often doing these studies on a shoestring, and they are early preliminary studies. But that heterogeneity means that you have the systematic review findings, but you should have a lot of caution about interpreting them. Just because you've got a lot of studies that are heterogeneous doesn't mean the systematic review findings are necessarily to be the definitive answer. And that's why you have to do a large-scale trial, because that's the only way you can actually answer the question. And you have to do that trial really well. Anybody here who has run a trial will know that it's hard to run a trial. And anybody here who's run a really big, good trial will know that it quite literally takes years off your life. So it's not something that people enter into lightly. So we did a whole series of studies, but the mainstay part of the sort of 8-year program of work was a cluster randomized control trial. This was the protocol that we pre-published, and we actually also did an update to the protocol just before we analyzed the data, because we were hit by the COVID pandemic. And we actually changed our primary endpoint to 1 year post-intervention rather than 2-year post-intervention to enable us to get all of our data in before the pandemic. Otherwise, the trial would only be interpretable if we have another major pandemic in the world, then we can interpret this trial. So one of the arguments for the trial was this sort of public health argument, that you're targeting executive function, mindfulness skills, these foundational skills that apply across the whole population. And so what you're expecting to see is a movement in the whole population towards the right, away from mental health problems, languishing and well-being, across to flourishing. And with these universal interventions, the argument is you're not expecting to see massive effects like, for example, CBT for panic disorder. You're expecting to see population small effects. But that is still worth it, as we've seen, for example, with heart health. If you can have small effects in heart health, you make major changes at a population level. Did a lot of thinking. Our population was this developmental windows before mental health problems arise, so 11 to 14. And we thought, where do most 11 to 14-year-olds spend most of their time? At school. So what's a good delivery place? Recruitment and delivery place for the intervention, so we thought schools. And we actually had 3 co-primary outcomes. Spent a lot of time thinking about this, and actually it involved changes to the sample size calculation and an increase in the funding of the trial actually by, I think, over £1 million to enable us to do this. But we looked at the psychopathology end of the scale, risk for depression. We also thought that actually in this age group, it's broader than that. We're interested in social, emotional, and behavioral problems in children. And we're also interested in the whole population. So we were interested in well-being. So these were the three co-primary outcomes that we had in the trial. The next question then was, what's the intervention? And we spent a lot of time thinking about the intervention, and two of our pilot trials had used an intervention which is called the .B intervention, a 10-week intervention. I think it's quite widely used actually around Australia. It was developed by the Mindfulness in Schools project. And it's interesting because it makes the argument, if you want something to be scalable and sustainable, get it delivered within schools by school teachers, which is kind of an interesting argument. It involved 10 sessions and some booster sessions in the following years. The idea would be that that could fit into a semester, a school semester. And the teachers received a lot of training. So we got them to go through an 8-week mindfulness program for themselves. We invited them to a 4-day residential training to be able to deliver the intervention to the children. And then we provided them with mentoring and support when they started to roll out the intervention. They ran one set of classes in a sort of non-evaluated way, and then the next set of classes were the classes that were part of the trial. The control group was social emotional education as normal. So we only recruited schools that had good social emotional education. So what we were doing was adding mindfulness training on top of that. So we had a good enough control group to which we thought we were adding something which potentially was going to provide added value. Now this is, in terms of the sort of story of science, a really interesting sort of subplot, if you like. Big trials like this have a sort of scientific advisory board, and they also have a trial steering committee. And about a year before we were due to analyze the results or even shut down the data, the chair of our trial steering committee said, have you thought through how you're going to interpret the findings in every possible scenario? And we said, well, sort of. He said, well, why don't you do that in a slightly more systematic way and and sort of develop a conceptual model that you can use to interpret your findings regardless of what you found. So we set out and did a scoping review of the literature of all the moderators, mechanisms, and implementation variables that could impact on an intervention like this. And we reviewed the literature, and we published it. And we published it before we analysed the findings. So what we essentially were looking at before we even analysed the findings, and I'm going to come back to this when we come to interpret it, is teaching kids in a classroom an intervention is not as simple as saying, here's a group of kids, here's an intervention, let's hope the intervention is effective. There's a lot of individual differences in that group of kids, within the classroom, within the school. That teacher, a lot of individual differences in that teacher. Some of them are going to be newly qualified, some of them are going to be experienced, some of them are going to have taken to mindfulness like a duck to water, others are going to struggle. The intervention itself, people say, well, mindfulness, that could mean a million different things. What is the intervention? How well was it delivered? What was the dose? What was the quality of the training? And how many of the kids did you actually reach? Then, how many of the kids engaged with the intervention? And if they engaged with the intervention, did the change happen through the mechanism? People often don't think about this kind of stuff, but we got it all into the model and we looked at the literature. And then really interestingly, the literature said, you know what? Every school is different in terms of things like school culture and school climate. And in some schools, dropping a mindfulness intervention will be dropping, I don't know, some seeds into the Queenstown desert. So it's going to thrive whatever you do. In others, it's going to be like a desert. The kind of prevailing culture of the school is really important. And the schools sit within neighborhoods. And in some of those neighborhoods, the kids are coming to school from abject poverty. They've not had breakfast. They've witnessed violence before they've even come into school. they're not really in a place to learn mindfulness, one could argue. And in other schools, they are in a really posh and high-achieving area, and somehow the mindfulness becomes in the service of them doing even better in all the other things they're already doing really well at. So the prevailing culture of the school is really important. I think this is one of the parts of the wake-up call, is that we need to be thinking about our interventions in this broader way. Mechanisms, moderators, implementation variables, wider factors. So we had that, and we used that model to specify our analysis plan, both for the main, does it work, but also how does it work for whom and in what context. What did we find? Well, the first thing to say about what we found is when we got the money to do this trial, the four of us looked at each other and we thought, this is the biggest study any of us have ever run. You know, when you get research funding, the first reaction is, oh, so good to be funded. And then your second reaction is, oh my goodness, I really said I was going to do that. And so we did it. This is the consort diagram. We set out to recruit 8,000 children for the sample size calculation. We set out to have robust randomization. We set out to retain the kids through 2 years of follow-up. And we achieved all of our targets. So one of the things we can say is that this was an adequately powered, very large, high retention study. I recruited the most extraordinary trial manager. I remember interviewing her and saying, this is probably one of the largest trials ever to be done. How do you feel about that? And she said, oh, excited. I said, you've got the job. I said, here's the target. If we achieve it, I'll get her to 2. She said, I'm up for that. Shake my hand. I have her to 2. The second thing about a trial is you want to make sure that the children and the schools are representative of the population you're seeking to target. So these are the schools. There's a lot of data on these slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the headlines. And of course, the DOIs, as I mentioned at the bottom, and the papers are all open access. So if you want to go and read them, you can. The schools were representative of the population we sought to target in terms of all of the key variables that one would be interested in: deprivation, state versus private education, the 4 countries of the United Kingdom, and so on. Likewise, the children were representative in terms of gender, ethnicity. Many mindfulness trials suffer because of having representative problems. This one didn't. And they were also representative in terms of their mental health at the beginning of the trial. And then the next thing that many trials suffer from is problems with retention and data quality. And again, we didn't suffer from that. We had an amazing team, we were well funded, and we were able to retain over 85% of all the children through the whole 2-year follow-up period. So the first thing I want to speak to is not the trial outcomes, but the basic premise of we have a mental health challenge amongst children, and schools might be a place to work with that. So this is a study with 26,000 children, and the first thing we did was look at to what degree do schools play a role in the variation in children's mental health. And the finding was extraordinarily little. And if you look at our study, it was between 1.5 and 3% of the variation in children's mental health can be explained at the school level. If you look at the literature more broadly, it doesn't go up much before above 8, 9, 10%. That doesn't mean schools don't have a role, but it doesn't mean we can outsource the mental health of children to schools. That's one of the really interesting implications of this, that the variation in young people's mental health is coming out with from schools. I think that's really interesting. The second thing was on our primary outcomes amongst those 26,000 children, this was quite alarming. So this is the Rose distribution. On the left, you've got people who've got probable depression. On the people who are on the right are free of any depressive symptoms or pretty well free. And as many as 1 in 3 children are reporting significant depressive symptoms. I think that's quite troubling in a representative sample of 11 to 14-year-olds. And that is replicated at the level of social, emotional, behavioral problems. Very high levels of problems, as many as 13 children, high in 6%, borderline in 13%. If you're a school teacher, that means if you're looking at a class of, how big are class sizes in Australia? Is it about 20, 30? Yeah, so it's 26. You can do the math of how many kids are going to have very high levels of social, emotional, behavioral problems in an average class. And our third co-primary outcome was well-being in 11 to 14-year-olds. And again, it's very similar. Yes, 55% you could say are healthy, 16% are flourishing, but you're a significant minority who are either languishing or have mental health problems. So what about the intervention? What did we find? So as I say, the primary outcome was 1 year, and the primary outcomes were risk for depression, depressive symptoms, social, emotional, behavioral problems, and well-being. And here was the main finding. The schools-based mindfulness training did not help the early teenagers' mental health or well-being overall. And we did this in the way in which I like to run my trials, which is we have a meeting like this with all the trial team, and the trial statistician is standing up here and he's presenting the data. And this is the data he presented. And he presented it, though, with Group A and Group B. So we didn't know which group was which. And we tried to interpret the findings without knowing which was the intervention group, which was the control group. And then we tried to write the first paragraph of the discussion without necessarily knowing which arm is which, so that we can interpret the findings blind to what automatically the mind tries to do. Is why has it turned out like this? What did we do wrong? What could have been done differently? You try to report the findings just straight down the line. There is no signal whatsoever here. You can't say if only it had been a bigger trial, if only we'd done something differently, the main outcomes would have been different. There is absolutely no signal. The intervention had no effect on our 3 co-primary outcomes. Now, we weren't powered for our secondary outcomes, but we had a set of very carefully selected secondary outcomes. And don't worry about going into the detail of these, because the finding, this is where the second slide comes up and the statistician puts them up and I go, ooh, let's see if something came up here of interest. And in the old days, investigators, possibly even still, would then write up the paper with the findings that were interesting. And we had pre-specified everything, so we didn't do that. And you will see that there are some small effects favoring one intervention over the other. On 5 of the outcomes, one intervention is doing slightly better than the other. So when we looked at it blind, I thought, well, that's encouraging. But then when he unblinded it, it suggested that the mindfulness intervention was actually slightly iatrogenic on those 5 outcomes. People were getting slightly worse on those 5 outcomes. Sobering, right? We also looked at cost effectiveness, and I won't go into that, but one of the papers reports that in detail. But just to say that this intervention cost about £70. So what's that about? $35 per pupil. They're not insignificant in a school budget. But we also had another set of secondary outcomes, which were quite interesting. Remember that the school teachers all went through a mindfulness training themselves and delivered the intervention. And so our question here was about the school teachers' mental health and well-being, but also about any effects on the school climate, the culture, the prevailing culture of the school. And here we did see findings. And actually there's fairly consistent findings from actually one of our previous studies, various other studies, that teachers benefit from the mindfulness training. They reported less burnout. The slightly interesting finding here, though, is when you have the longer follow-up period, those effects largely washed out. at the longer follow-up period,
Okay.
which is one of the advantages of having a big trial with a longer follow-up. But interestingly, effects on school climate were significant. By climate, I mean things like the way in which the kids and the teachers view the leadership, the relationships, the sense of safety and connectedness, sense of feeling respected and respecting one another, a sense of safety, anti-bullying strategies, these kinds of things. The climate findings did not wash out. Actually, at 1 year follow-up, and we've just recently analysed the 2 year follow-up, they didn't wash out. So this is where Nick Axford's invitation to publish this scoping model came in really helpful. And we asked ourselves which contextual factors could help us understand the findings and point to ways forwards. And we spent probably about 6 to 12 months working on this, an amazing team of people working on this. And individual differences in kids. Kids with more mental health problems did worse than kids with no mental health problems in the mindfulness intervention. Kids with more mental health problems did worse in the mindfulness intervention than kids without mental health problems. Schools in areas with higher levels of deprivation did better than schools in areas that were more affluent, fewer free school meals. Those are probably the two most robust things. But this was really interesting. We asked all 4,000 odd children what they thought of the mindfulness program and how much they practiced. What they thought of the program was really interesting. So if you imagine a little curve, this is, I would not recommend this to my worst friend. So it's a 5-point scale. I think that was one of the questions. This was every child throughout the world should receive this program, and this was somewhere in between. The distribution looked like that. So a lot of kids didn't like the program. Some liked it a bit, and a slightly larger group, but less than the ones who didn't like it, thought it was absolutely great. Then we asked them, how much did you actually engage with the program? How much did you practice the program? Hardly at all. Throughout the 10 weeks of the program, the vast majority of kids said that they maybe did one mindfulness practice once. Interesting, right? What about mechanisms of action? Well, we weren't wrong about the mechanisms of action in the sense that executive function and mindfulness skills, this is a separate paper we're writing up at the moment, are associated with changes in mental health in this developmental window. If people have better executive function, if children have better executive function and they have mindfulness skills, they do better in this developmental window. But we ran a whole separate trial, 580 kids, led by Tim Dalglish and Sarah Jane Blakemore in Cambridge, in which we looked only at mechanisms. And so this study was asking, does the mindfulness intervention, compared to another intervention, study support skills, an effective intervention, improve mindfulness skills, and through improving mindfulness skills, improve the outcomes? And the answer is no. So what this tells us is that we were right about the mechanism. It's just that the mindfulness training doesn't affect the mechanism. So executive skills and mindfulness are important to children, but this particular intervention doesn't seem to touch those outcomes. So this was 8 years of work, which we've spent the last year or so thinking about. And I think that's been really helpful. And people who I really respect have spoken to me about the findings and have said things like, this is really helpful, it's a real wake-up call. In what way is it a wake-up call? Well, first, I think what it does is it tells us that one size doesn't fit all. Why are we designing education systems more broadly with an idea of one size fits all. It doesn't make sense. And specifically with mindfulness training, I'm not sure we should be thinking about universal mindfulness training. Yeah, the data seems to suggest that, right? It's the sort of thing that people have opinions about, but actually this data points to if you force kids to do this, they don't, and it doesn't have an effect. Now that's not true in higher education, where young people choose to do mindfulness and you do see effects. Giulietta Galanti here has done a study with university students, which has been replicated. If they opt in and they want to do it, then you see effects, but this was not that. And we've done quite a lot of talking to young people and thinking about it, and they have said things to us. I'm going to show you a video at the end. They have said things to us like, why don't you just let us do the things we like to do? Hang out with our friends, game, do sports. The ones who like sport. If they don't like sport, don't make me do sport. Music. The ones who like music. If you don't like music, don't make me do music. And through those activities, maybe they can learn these skills. I think the second thing I've really learned, and people ask me, why didn't you think of this before? We did all the things right before. It's just the learning, I guess, has come afterwards. But I think in this space, we need to so seriously think about co-design. Not, I've got a good idea about how we do it, and what do you think of it? Co-design means sitting down together and saying, what do you think mental health means to you? What role might schools play? What might that look like? Can we do this together? Some of the big successful anti-bullying campaigns are run by peers, and they work. There is no magic bullet. Interventions need to focus on, first, the wider context. Until we start doing things about patriarchal forces and social forces that impact on girls in this developmental window, girls are going to experience more mental health problems. Don't put it on the girls. Put it on the wider level that is putting those pressures on the girls. Same thing. If you've got a society in which a third of the kids are turning up from places where they are entitled to free school meals and living in abject poverty, it's not a surprise that they're going to have struggles with their mental health. Do something about the inequality. Not in the sense that this is a zero-sum game, but this is something that I think is really important. There's also the meso context. One of the headline findings from this study, and we're writing up a series of papers on this at the moment, is that school climate and school culture is one of the variables that is most associated with and predictive of young people's mental health. When kids are in a school where they feel connected, there's a sense of trust, there's a sense of safety, they do better. You're probably looking at it like, that's kind of obvious, isn't it? But not a lot of schools fully achieve that. But instead, the schools that aren't achieving that are maybe teaching those kids social emotional learning programs. I'm not saying that's not a good idea, but maybe a good place to start would be focusing on their culture and changing the culture of the school, because that will have more than likely drop-down effects, secondary effects on the kids. And then thirdly, at the individual level, we need to recognize the different values, strengths, and goals of children. And I think just in relation to mental health status, my own interpretation, this is only my interpretation, but my interpretation of the findings in relation to the moderator effect of mental health status in children is that what we were doing was helping the children who had more mental health problems become more aware of their mental health problems, but not giving them the tools to do anything with that. And that's why they got worse. It's not that they didn't benefit, they actually got worse. And we're not the first trial to do that. 2 CBT trials have had the same thing. And there was a mentoring finding that had the same thing. What you're doing is you're helping these kids to become more aware of their difficulties. And actually, sometimes lack of awareness can be protective. And I think that's quite sobering too. Those kids need access to specialist, high-quality mental health provision within and without schools. And thirdly, if the kids aren't motivated to do the work, then don't expect the changes. This is a really inspiring school that was a struggling school taken over by a head and a senior leadership team in a district in North London that served a very mixed demographic. the Elizabeth Gareth Anderson School. She was the first woman, it's an all-girls school, first woman who was medically qualified in the UK, and a suffragette that was named after her. And this school was turned around in terms of its whole branding, its vision, its modus operandi, its uniform, to the point, as you can see, Michelle Obama went to visit it, and she has engaged with the school in a somewhat ongoing way. But what that head and what that senior leadership team was changed the vision, the culture, and the climate of that school to a place where the kids took pride in their school, there was a sense of mutual respect, and they thought through carefully how to work with diversity. Check out the school uniform. It was designed by the kids with a fashion designer. So that the kids who wore her hijab and the kids who came from different backgrounds could still wear the same school uniform but adapt it for their cultural background. How cool is that? Nick Allen was on our scientific advisory board. He was always incredibly brilliant. In fact, I think he originated here in Australia and then moved to the States. He said, well, there's no such thing as a free lunch in behaviour change, mate. Behaviour change is hard. And as Mark Williams points out in interpreting the findings, mindfulness is only mindfulness if people are practicing the skills, and the practice of those skills is leading to observable changes. And we weren't seeing that with these kids. They weren't practicing the skills, and hence there were no observable changes. And then Tamsin Ford asks, mental health delivery in schools, is it really the teacher's job? I'm not saying I know the answer to this. You know, I don't spend my day every day in schools. But a lot of teachers will say this isn't their job. They feel quite overwhelmed, out of their depth. They're not trained to deal with that subgroup of kids with quite high levels of mental health problems. And then finally, Sarah Jane and Tim are going on to do work saying, well, what are the mechanisms that we could potentially work with in young people in other and interesting ways? So Sarah is particularly interested in puberty and the role, the way in which puberty affects social emotional changes at different rates for boys and girls in this developmental period, and this work is still ongoing. And Tim is running a program looking at the mechanism of change, of decentering. So all of this is fairly sobering, and I want to end on a high note and go back to the work with adults and say, so we've done great work with the treatment of depression and the prevention of depression in adults, secondary prevention anyway. And I think one of the things that is happening in our centre and elsewhere, which I think is really promising, and I know that Julieta has published a meta-analysis and has more work coming up in this area, that I wonder if we think about cultural change at the level of organisations and individuals, one of the ways to potentially think about this is to go with the Jeffrey Rose argument and say, what are the skills at a populational level that we're wanting to teach in a way that maximises reach, reaches as many people as possible, in a way that engages them, that's effective but is also not harmful. And I want to offer you this metaphor. It's a metaphor of a funnel. And people like Vikram Patel are doing work in places like India and China and South America with this kind of model. The left of the funnel is the whole population. And then people who engage with these ideas and these curricula go down the funnel and learn these practices at greater levels of depth. And what I'd like to suggest to you about the opening of the funnel, because at the moment everybody defaults to, and I'm being quite controversial here, perhaps deliberately, defaults to well, surely it's the web and it's the digital world. And I'm not saying that's not a good idea, but I have started to think that maybe that's not right. That maybe the best way of reaching the most people in the most accessible way possible is to do a mental health equivalent of when you get into a train station, the only way to get from the concourse to the entrance is up the flight of stairs with the beautiful lights and the nice artwork and the music that takes you up those flight of stairs, and you've just suddenly done, without thinking about it, 50 steps of exercise. Can we design workplaces, schools, communities, housing complexes, in a way that support mental health and well-being. Gorky Park in New York has put in this massive swing set. It's really well lit up. It's because all the kids were hanging out, causing trouble. It's very nicely designed. And when the kids go up to the swing set, lights come up. And it depends on the time of the day. And it attracts the kids to hang out together. And they're overlooked by the surrounding houses. So they don't get up to trouble, but they enjoy the swing set. And they use it, they give really good feedback. So at this kind of design level, can we think about promoting communities, schools, work cultures that support mental health? And then as we go down the funnel, for those who are interested, can we give them, this is a book Mark and Danny wrote. 7 billion people in the world, 2 million have bought this. That's a very small number, but nonetheless significant. And actually most people don't read books. But can we have low intensity interventions, and then higher intensity interventions, and higher intensity interventions? And what we've started to demonstrate in our data is that the lower intensity interventions are lower risk, but have small effects and are more accessible. The more intensive interventions have bigger effects, but are obviously less accessible. It's kind of no-brainer, right? It's like stepped care. And I want to just end with some data that's just about to be submitted that I'm really excited about, which is this curriculum that we've developed, which is a curriculum for people who are graduates of 8-week classes. And these are people who want to take their learning further. These are adults. And the argument is, can we take people to a place of much deeper well-being and potentially even flourishing? And we've analysed the data in this way, and it's extraordinary. This is, on the left you can see the control group, which is a waiting list control group of people who started off relatively well, and you see absolutely no change, and we had a stable baseline. But what you can see on the right is the Jeffrey Rose argument for the people who went through this quite intensive curriculum. They wanted to be there. They engaged with it. They liked it. A third of them went from the well-being range to the flourishing range. I think that's so cool. Can we think about this funnel model where potentially we have this idea of mental health for all and changes in this distribution? And I want to give the final word to the young people in the study. We spent a day with them, and this is just a tiny little clip in which we asked them, what are your hopes for the future vis-a-vis mental health? And the first young lad who speaks, when I first heard him speak, I asked the guy who facilitated the day with me, Tyson Joseph, who's this very charismatic filmmaker. He does really interesting work with people like Stormzy now. And he facilitated the day with these young people. And the first young person who speaks talks about money. And I smiled and I said to Tyson, oh, it's funny that you should talk about money. He says, he doesn't mean money, Willem. He means it's the freedom from, he came from a very deprived part of East London. It's the freedom from that life he's talking about. He's not talking about money. So I just ask you to bear that in mind, because that was me and Tyson standing there watching this the first time we saw it. Okay, here we go.
In the future, I would like to be rich. I want to have enough money to not worry about anything that may happen.
I want to be someone who's inspirational.
Well, in the future, the main thing I really want for myself is the career that I've always wanted, which is to be a pilot or to be in the RAF. This is something I really want to do.
I would like my life to look like colourful. I'd like to live in the moment, just to be able to enjoy life the way I'd want it to be.
Did you see the video? No. Oh no, can we do it again? Sorry, what did I do wrong? How's that? No. Well, it doesn't matter. They look lovely, but they say the same thing. Don't worry about it. We'll just want to have some time for questions. Thank you. That's all I've got. So I think there's some time for questions now.
So thank you so much, Willem, for joining us. It's one thing to read these amazing and decades or years worth of work that went into these studies and to kind of think about the impact. It's a whole other to kind of just hear them unpacked. And I hope you'll join in with me sort of in recognizing kind of just how wonderful it is to have Willem here to kind of explain everything he's learned over the course of these trials and writing up these results. And hopefully this has given some food for thought to some things going on here in Australia and how we can think about mindfulness, meditation, and education in the school context and more broadly going forward. And hopefully some people here have gotten some hints for how they might approach their studies that are sort of either getting started or coming to their end. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you for coming out. If you're not on our mailing list and you do want to be, please grab myself or Kathleen or somebody else and just let us know. Otherwise, we look forward to you joining us again in the future. Thank you.